crowd. So I don't know if any of the women here who were born in the 80s or 70s and raised in the 80s and 90s can relate to this, but the worst thing you could call me in my young years was thunder thighs. Yeah. You hear some O's like, right to the gut, right? So I remember the first time hearing this. I'd never even heard it before. It's not like my mom talked about that at home. But it was a boy in school, and I was 9 years old. And when I was 8, something very tragic had happened to a girl my age in our neighborhood, and it had taught me that I couldn't even trust parents. And shortly after that, my childhood life was uprooted from my childhood home, and we started moving. And so I was being constantly introduced to new communities, groups of people, and this kid who called me Thunder Thighs was the first year, the first school. And it rocked me to the core, but I didn't know why. Nobody had ever told me thunder was bad, but it was the tone of his voice and the way he looked at me with disgust. And when I was 8, when this tragic thing had happened and we started moving, sugar became a balm for me. I started hoarding little bits of sugar. We didn't have much money, so that looked like miniature marshmallows and chocolate chips in my Care Bears backpack. Hid it in my mom's sewing box, because she never did her sewing, and until she found it. But this helped me deal with anxiety, which is another word I hadn't heard back then, of just feeling not safe all the time. Not safe, can't trust adults. And so I started also developing earlier than girls my age, and my Polish Celtic heritage mix made for a big-boned, strong mountain woman, but I didn't live in the mountains, and I didn't know that that's what I was being built for. Fortunately, that would change. This is in California, and in the 80s, like I said, and I thought, oh, it's bad to be strong. It's bad to be big. And I begged my mom to let me go on her diet with her, still 9 years old. And I remember the first morning, her showing me how to put the cup on the scale and the pineapple chunks in so that I knew how much I could have for breakfast. And it was the era of non-fat, no fat. That was the secret, which everybody now knows, at least the adults. That means lots of sugar, which also worked for me, but didn't help with the whole losing weight part. And I didn't have a lot of organized activities. We lived in a pretty rough neighborhood. I couldn't ride my bike anymore like I had it in my childhood home. And you know, my little tassels on the end of my banana seat bike and a rainbow with the butterfly with a rainbow coming out of its butt on the seat. And I felt so free on that bike. And now I couldn't even ride my bike because it wasn't safe. And then it didn't help that 10 years after that, at the ripe age of 19, I decided I was old enough to get married. He was Australian, in all fairness. And it was just the beginning of the internet and email, and so our phone bill was $2,000 in 3 months. It was cheaper to get married so we could date in each other's countries. So this man, 6'1", could not keep weight on his body to save his life, which meant he wanted things that, you know, he ate things that had lots of fat in them and trying to bulk him up. But next to him and all of our amazing mountain athlete friends, much like Shannon, who could just get to the top of a mountain with hardly trying, and they were racing each other. I was like, I'll just keep the home fires burning. Dinner will be ready when you get home. And about 5 years into this relationship, we found out we were pregnant. And he'd been clear when we were dating that he really loved me, but I wasn't his type. He used those words. Should have been a red flag with the accent, just changed it. I wasn't his type. And then while I was pregnant, I got bigger, and he found somebody who was his type, but didn't tell me. And so 8 months pregnant, I found out my husband was having an affair, and with a woman who I would have given anything at that time to be. She could keep up with him on the mountain. And that choice led to me diminishing myself even more. I'd spent most of my life trying to minimize and shrink, even though this eating habit of trying to deal with my anxiety through food was working against that. And so I minimized myself in other ways. And one of the ways I did that was just kind of like, okay, well, if you don't want to be married, I can just move on and not fight for that relationship. But he decided we wanted to stay together. And we came just a few blocks away. The Tower Building is the old hospital. And in that hospital, my son would be born not viable. He had died during birth. My only child. And in that experience, I became so close to what I understood as God, which was this feeling of love that is just indescribable. I felt partnered, I felt husbanded, I felt held, even though all of this chaos that made no sense to me was happening in our relationship. And then this tragic loss of my child. But that love had been so close that that experience actually was this catalyzing moment for me. And it launched me into a new adventure, the adventure of finding myself. And so I graduated college, which I had dropped out of. I didn't mention that, but I dropped out of that college to come here and have a mountain life. And in 3 weeks, I lost my son, my marriage, and my home in Colorado, and went back to school. And then started a nonprofit, trekked in the Himalaya, lost all this weight because that's what grief will do to a person, but still felt like that chubby girl who couldn't do anything, even though I was doing all of these amazing things around the world. Then I got a job on Mount Rainier in Washington, a glaciated mountain, a little bit different than our mountains here, just about the same size as our 14ers, but with glaciers on it, so it's a little bit different. And this was me taking on an adventure. And I would work at Camp Muir, which was at 10,000 feet. The bus would drop us off at 5,400 feet, and my commute was about 5,000 feet and 4.5 miles or so over a snow field. Still did not believe I was an athlete. But I would do that 2 to 3 times a week to go up and cook for the guys. There's that home fires part of me. They would take guests up the mountain and summit this amazing mountain. And they'd always come down and they'd say, hey Heather, when are you gonna hop on the rope? As though it was just a trip to the mall. And I was like, I'm just not that kind of girl. This is amazing to me that I'm living this life and I'm living on the side of the mountain, and I don't know, I'm sure I will someday. But inside of me, I didn't think I was capable of it. Well, I happened to turn 29 years old when I was on that mountain, and we'd had 3 weeks where there were no successful summit attempts. Shortly before those storms had rolled in, one of our most experienced guides had died on the mountain because she forgot to double back her harness and fell into a crevasse, which was another reason I thought, if she can't do this, how can I survive that? But my friend Ryan, who was the guide who'd introduced me to this job and helped me get this job, pulled me to the side the week I was turning 29, and he said, you know, you can do this, and you really deserve to see what it's like at the summit. And he had known my story, he knew how much I had been through, and he believed in me. And I thought, if I have come this far, and I do not try to get to the top of that mountain, I will never forgive myself. So I stayed up a double shift up there, and finally was like, okay, the weather cleared, and they said we're gonna make a push for the mountain, the summit tomorrow. And so I went down into the guide shack, filled with farting, snoring men, and laid wide awake on plywood, thinking, what in the world am I thinking right now? And I was so scared. I was so afraid that I wasn't capable. I was that chubby little girl who had been called Thunder Thighs all those years ago. And I laid there, and that relationship with divine love, I reached out with all of my heart, like I often did during this time. And I said, love, what do you need me to know right now? And this is what came. You belong here. You are ready. You are not alone. And this peace came over me with this feeling that it was true. And those words came again. You belong here. You are ready. You're not alone. And I must have fallen asleep because all of a sudden our alarm clock went off and it was midnight and time to put on our harness and our helmet and our headlamp and clip into the rope. Now, if you don't know about glacier travel, everybody who's going up the mountain is connected to a rope. You have an ice axe because the ice is really slippery on glaciers, and especially when it's on a steep slope. And so the idea is that if somebody slips, they can self-arrest with the ice axe and everybody else drops to the ground and try to arrest the fall. But the rope, it's really important how much tightness and looseness is in the rope in between climbers. And so I'd been taught this at the beginning of the summer, and I knew how to self-arrest with my ice axe, and that was all good. And we started to climb up the mountain, and I had watched the trail of the headlamps every day go up and up and up. And now I was in that train of headlamps, and I knew exactly what it looked like from down below. And slowly, as the day would go, we had the moon, so you could actually see like the rock cliff side of the ice, and you'd hear the ice crack, and you'd hear some of it fall, and you just hope that it wouldn't fall on you. And we kept going, and we got to this first spot where you could spin climbers, and that meant to turn people around who just weren't ready to continue on. And we had a couple on this climb, a husband and wife, and the guides wanted to spin both of them. They were both struggling. And the wife said, "Okay, yeah, thanks," and she was fine. The man, 6'5", southern drawl, said, "I did not pay this much to come this far to turn around and give up now." And he refused. So he stayed on the rope. And we continued up to our next spot, the last spot you could spin people. And again, it was clear he was not strong enough to keep going. But he started telling us about how he was a triathlete. Did we know how athletic he was and how hard he trained for this, and that he could do this? And again, the guides relented. And then they clipped him on behind me. And so he was actually at the end of our rope. And we started heading up the next stretch. And the bridges across the crevasses, or bridge is a very fancy word for a tool ladder. So metal tool ladder with metal rungs, and you have metal teeth on the bottom of your feet, in your crampons. And so metal teeth on metal rungs of a ladder, not super easy. You need to make sure you have the right amount of rope in between you and the person behind you. And so you ask, "Are you ready?" And you make sure that they're ready to step forward when you step forward, so that that slack in the rope stays the right amount. And he confirmed he was ready, and so I took a step forward, and I stepped onto the rung on the ladder, and then when I went to take the next step, the rope went taut over the middle of the crevasse. And my right leg dropped into the crevasse, and all of my weight was on my left leg, on my left thunder thigh. And I turned and yanked the rope with all of my might to pull him forward, which he did come forward. And the guy in front of me should have been ready to self-arrest with the axe, because if I had fallen in, the guy behind me was coming straight down on top of me. The guy in front of us was the only one who could keep us from all going in as a train, but he was a deer in headlights. He could not believe what was happening. And I stood up with my pack and all of my weight on my left leg and stepped off of that bridge onto the other side of the crevasse. And it was clear to me nobody was going to help me. There were no guides at the back. They were like, "Oh, Heather, you're doing so great. You know what we do up here." And they just left me back there with this guy. And there was no way to spin him around, but it was clear to me that the altitude, he was not acclimatizing, and he had the mind of a toddler. So I decided I would start speaking to him as though he were my child. And it worked. I would just say, "Okay, tell me what you're thinking about. Tell me how you're feeling right now." And he would say things that didn't make a lot of sense because he wasn't all there. But we got him up to the top of the mountain, to the summit, where there's a crater before you get to the highest point. And he stopped in the crater, so he didn't make it to the summit anyways. But he dropped into the crater, and the guides were able to give him the treatment that he needed with medication and water and food, and get him back to a safer place in his thought. And the rest of us climbed to the top of the summit. And we got up there, and one of my favorite pictures to this day is this horrible picture. I don't know, I've got a digital picture of the picture. I don't know where the picture is. But it's of me, so proud, in my big red parka, and my shell pants, and my harness, and my helmet on cockeyed, and I'm just beaming at the top of this mountain. You can see far into Canada. It was so clear. And we took all these pictures, and then my friend Ryan, who I mentioned earlier, came up to me. He said, we're going to go back down into the crater now, and everybody's going to just take a break. But I want you to stay up here by yourself so that you can reflect on what a badass you are. No, I told you you could do it. I told you so. Why didn't you believe me? Why didn't you come sooner? Just beaming pride for me and such joy that I could see the view he told me I deserved. So we came down that mountain, and we got down to Basecamp, and this man came up to me, this 6'5" Southern man, bawling like a baby, apologizing that he had put my life at risk because of his pride. His words. And it was so moving to me, but I realized that what fell into that crevasse was my loathing for my thighs, which had been the albatross around my neck that had saved me. And I decided that I would never do that. And one of the things I forgot to mention was when I stepped across that crevasse, the first thought was, I'll never hate my thunder thighs again. The second thought was, I do belong here. I am ready, and I am definitely not alone. And so, in that crevasse, fell that self-doubt, fell all of those old beliefs that had been put on me by the 80s and 90s, and many of us who have survived that. I'm proud of you all. But when you see me on the street, I would love for you to call me Thunder Thighs. When did we decide that thunder was a bad thing? We are mountain people, and we know that when you see lightning, what's the first thing you do? You start counting until you hear what? Thunder. The thunder. Thunder is